speaker then I'd like to introduce Yvette Hutchinson, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Theatre and Performance Studies, the University of Warwick. Her research focuses on Anglophone African theatre and history. She's Associate Editor of the South African Theatre Journal. Her Leaving project resulted in the monograph South African Performance and Archives of Memory. She has a wonderfully detailed bio, which she has graciously given me permission to cut, so I'll leave it at that, but nevertheless. And her paper today is Accessing the Zone of Occult Instability Where People Dwell, South African Engagement with Colonialism and Ethnography in the Intercultural, Post-Colonial and Global Context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you to the organisers for this wonderful opportunity. So it's noteworthy that intercultural exchange is as old as time. Yet from the mid-20th century, it's become a focus of particular concern. And I think that's interesting and linked very closely to histories of colonialism that are not yet past. So much attention has been focused on the processes of various artists engaging with intercultural exchanges within and between cultures, but less on where and how they facilitate audience engagement with the products that emerge from these processes. So I want to focus on the role context plays in facilitating audience awareness of their own intersubjectivities and positionalities in relation to contested memories of histories, particularly of colonialism. So just the real frame for my piece is Baruch's assertion that interpretation and use of culture has to be confronted within the particularities of specific historic conditions. And I think that this notion of the perspective on these histories is really important, what each particular context is bringing to these engagements. However, this call to remain rooted in particularities is increasingly difficult to realize, given that many countries are haunted by the legacies of colonialism, but their citizens are increasingly mobile, and their economies and governments are anxious to remain actively engaged in complex global economies where transnational corporations often have more power and money than individual governments. Audiences also have a sense that they live in a global world and can engage with work from anywhere, particularly at festivals, which epitomize how easily cultural production can circulate in this age of globalization. But, as Christine McMahon has so clearly articulated, without necessarily meaningful contextual cultural encounters, because festivals are very affected by sponsorship and programming, which often mirror neoliberal conditions that define today's economies. So the challenge for artists is to facilitate contextualized cultural encounters that retain interventionist potential by making audiences aware of inherent ideological implications, not only of the work, but the context in which the works are being performed. So how do they engage with the implications not only for themselves, but for the people being represented in the work? And for this, I turn back to Fanon and his suggestion in the wake of the Algerian liberation of the late 1950s, that for the artist and the intellectual, it's not enough to try to get back to the people in that past out of which they have already emerged. He says, rather, we must join them in that fluctuating moment which they are now just giving shape to, and which, as soon as it has started, will be the signal for everything to be called into question. Let there be no mistake about it. It is to this zone of occult instability where the people dwell that we must come. So rather than re-establishing stable narratives of history or identity, Fanon suggests that an artist and an intellectual needs to question what aspects of the past are being reclaimed in the present, and what are the consequences of those choices. He links this to the endeavor of reconnecting people in this zone of occult instability where the oppressed people have got their sense of themselves. This term occult signals both the metaphysical realm and that which is not easily apprehended or understood, including aspects of the past that are complex, emotional, or disavowed, that remain unstable in their various ways that we apprehend them. This is where performance can play an important role in highlighting various perceptions of the past and approaches to revisiting contested histories. Dwight Conquergood asserts that a performance lens can open the space between analysis and action and pull the pin on the binary opposition between theory and practice. Now, this is particularly important given that colonial histories are increasingly returning to haunt not only the post-colonial countries, but actually Europe in the 21st century, as seen by these recent engagements. So Blanchard's exhibition in Marseille, it was a big project. European Attraction Limited's restaged Human Zoo in Oslo last year that was very controversial to commemorate the Norwegian Jubilee of 1914. Bailey's exhibitions. Action Zoo Humane actually revisited the 1913 World Fair in Ghent in 2013 and created the Truth Commission, using verbatim to kind of re-engage what does that mean now, looking at migration and immigration policy in Belgium. And Goran Olsen's documentary concerning violence, which has premiered and won many awards in the last few months. And indeed in Britain, there's been a plethora of symposia and discussions around this documentary. Now, all of these engagements have been marked by controversy of some sort, particularly because European artists have been responsible for creating and curating the material. So even though Olsen's documentary has literally just taken Fanon's text and juxtaposed that to archival visual material, so he himself has not got anything apart from the way he's edited that material together, he has said that he has concerns, and I quote, "As Europeans, we have enormous concerns about making a film on what happens to people living in sub-Saharan Africa. Even attempting to make films about Africa can be imperialist and a patronizing exercise." So these questions of in whose interest, to what ends, and what terms this work has been done is central. But I also think where it is performed and who is performing it, how audience engagement is facilitated is important. So I'm going to focus particularly on South African engagements, re-engagements with their own colonial history, with work that has toured beyond South Africa in my paper. Now, I'm not covering, when I wrote my abstract, I was really ambitious, and I realized that I was offering or suggesting I might offer more than I possibly could. So work that has engaged with this is Handspring Puppet Company's early work, particularly the collaboration with William Kentridge, Bailey, Stephen Cohen. And then Magnet Theatre's work is really interesting because Rain in the Dead Man's Footprints engages with the genocide of Bushman people, and Cargo with slavery, but they have not toured those pieces outside of the country. And I think that says something about intraculturalism and the need to remain within a context that is very complex, but not actually move it out into a wider context. So they've only toured Every Day, Every Year I Am Walking, which deals with migrancy, and is particularly interesting because Mark Fleischman is looking for what he calls the dramaturgy of the absent. So how do you represent people without speaking for them? Okay, so this work is quite nuanced work. But I'm going to go right back, and it was really interesting to me that Rick Knowles highlighted modernism. I'm going right back to the work of Handspring and modernist engagements to look at how theatre performance can facilitate this intersubjective dialogue in this intercultural context. But I just want to say as a kind of disclaimer that when this is happening in South Africa, it's very involved with actually demands around citizenship and where the politics of memory intersects with discourses of belonging and power in the present. So it has a very politically specific mandate within the country that I think is very different when it's touring outside of the country. So I'm looking at how do we implicate spectators, but also show potential agency when raising issues around conflicted perspectives of culture. Don't worry. So the intersubjectivity I refer to here is not the Lacanian or Foucaultian in sense of the individual intersubjective. Here I'm interested in how do we negotiate a cross-representation of various hegemonies, understanding not only perspectives of different people but different times, and how do the assumptions and aesthetic choices of artists work. So given the work that I'm specifically looking at is dealing with anthropological issues and the same kind of ethical and methodological problems, I've returned to Johannes Fabian's work, where he has called for the creative intersubjective production of knowledge. And how do we not temporalize cultures? So we look from our perspective at another time, and as if there is kind of a linear narrative, but also an us and a them. How do we implicate the present in the past and make visible not only the legacies of representation, but how they were created and how that is inflected? And how do we facilitate an encounter that highlights this fluctuating movement, plural perception, and a sense of simultaneity and complexity? And I argue that we can do that in primarily three ways. So using metaphoric ambivalent, and that was something that was really rich in the last paper. Creating gaps in representations or narratives so that participants, audience members, have to actively make meaning. And we have to reference intersubjective time so that we're not going, oh, that was then, but actually look at how does it inflect in the now. So how do we do that? How do artists do that? So Handspring Puppet Company, this is just a sense of their work. And I'm looking at Wojciech in 92, but the kind of the blue pieces are pieces that overtly have looked at colonial work. Now, for those of you that don't know Handspring's Puppet Company's work, they work collaboratively to improvise with classic text often. They create puppets, and the puppets are an intercultural production in themselves. South Africa doesn't have a puppet tradition of its own, so they have drawn on European string and rod puppets together with Central and East Asian forms of puppetry, particularly banraku, where the puppeteers are visible with the puppets and interact with them visibly. Now, I've written elsewhere about their processes, so what I'm interested in is how they have taken these European texts. So if you think Wojciech, Faustus, Ubu, these are European canonical texts, and inflected them into the African context, so on the Highveld in Africa. And then what do these mean both for South African and non-South African audiences? Now, it's interesting that Wojciech originally opened in 92, but that it retoured in 2011 and 2013. And Munich was really horrified when they said, please can we have the puppets back because we're going to use them again. Now, their choice to adapt these canonical texts was not arbitrary, but highlighted how European culture had indelibly impacted on South African culture, not only in education, but in perceptions of what constituted theatre. So John Carney said that his first experiences of theatre were staging adaptations of Wojciech, Faust, Marat Sade, Beckett, many absurdist plays, and Antigone, and that this became the raw material for their later work on Warza Albert and the Island. So there's a kind of dialogue going on between the European canon, the avant-garde, and the kind of African performance traditions. So they didn't simply restage these texts as we see from the titles, but they were drawing attention to legacies of colonialism, but also how they inflected back from the South African tradition into Europe. Now, the Buckner play was particularly interesting because it's unfinished text of 1837, which explores jealousy, murder, and the struggle of an ordinary German to cope in a newly industrialized society. But the German soldier here is translated into a migrant mine worker on the Highveld of Johannesburg in 1956. He's experimented on by a doctor, he's moralized at and preached at about the values of enlightenment, and his mind becomes increasingly fragile as he's cornered by issues of status, money, and power, where he's completely disempowered and feels out of control. So Buckner's play was perhaps one of the first plays to engage with the tragedy of the ordinary human person faced with these overwhelming systems that surrounded him. But the shift in focus to the mines is important because merchant capitalism provided the original motivations for European colonial expansion globally as they sought to secure maritime routes between Europe and Asia and then control Africa itself when its resources became evident. So, for example, in South Africa, diamonds were discovered in 1867 and gold in 1884. And as Rosalind Morris says, the history of South Africa is indissociable from the history of mining. So the South African War, was about controlling these resources, as were the setting up of cities, ransacking, rural areas for cheap labor, and the policies of apartheid were to control mobility of workers. Mining continued to be the economic basis for much of the economic growth of the global north in the 19th century. and is still true today with transnational corporations. So, for example, South Africa possesses 50% of the world's gold and 80% of the world's platinum reserves. Now, platinum is essential for catalytic converters that reduce exhaust emissions, and so are essential for the world's ecological future. So these are current issues that we all engage with. But the experiences for men like Wojciech and the consequences for his family and community remains the same, as we saw from the 2014 mine strikes in South Africa, which after 5 months, 34 deaths and 78 injuries caused by police firing on protesters, ended up with a deal where the lowest paid worker received an wage increase from $400 to $1,100 a month. But as the play suggests, wages are not the only issues. Men leave their families and traditions to carve out new identities for themselves below the earth. There's a rich polyglot society, but also huge social problems. High crime rate, gangsterism, where they view women as objects because they live in single-cell hostels, 8 to 16 men in a room, and their encounters with women tend to be only with prostitutes. They go home once a year. Minors fear the face of maiming and death, and various lung diseases like silicosis. There's about a 22% rate, and it's an irreversible and progressive illness that increases their chances of TB fourfold, to say nothing of HIV/AIDS. So how does Handspring engage audiences who are not involved in this world of mining with these experiences at theatres and festivals? And what does it mean? You know, how do they engage intersubjectivities around these issues that I think most of us don't encounter? I don't think we think about our catalytic converters when we get in our cars. And I think this is through the puppets themselves, where they are non-realistic. The hand carving is evident. They're visibly being manipulated. And Jane Taylor suggests that it's through surrogacy that the audiences are drawn in, where the instinct, she argues, to anthropomorphize or parent predisposes us to project human capacities onto a puppet. And the puppet becomes surrogate for the infant, who relies on us recognizing their potentiality and therefore protecting and nurturing them. And this potentiality we see in these characters as well. So you've got Maria, where she discovers herself in a mirror after she's taken a lover, but projects her anxiety about this onto her baby. But these are all puppets. And this kind of triangle between the mother, the mirror, and the child, we are making sense of in this moment. So this intersubjectivity is facilitated by our actively inserting ourselves in the spaces between the puppets, the puppeteers, and sometimes the back projections in order to make meaning of the scenes. The performance is similar to comic books. This has really helped me understand how this works. That deals in visuality and spatiality alongside textuality. Now, Lowe says that comics are a medium of conjunction between a number of elements, parameters, and procedures, where each panel is dependent upon the reader linking it and its semiotic space through his or her interpretive imagination to the panels around it. This involves the reader actively making meaning in the gaps or the blank spaces between the panels. Scott McCloud argues that we do this by means of a process of closure, whereby we observe the parts but perceive the whole. So this means we have to use our imagination to transform these ideas into a whole, and thereby become silent accomplices, partners in crime. And this is making the invisible visible, but we are actively doing it in our own heads. Now, the puppeteers say the same thing, that basically a puppet is a dead object. You can see it, but it only lives because you make it. And he says, therefore, the puppets, we turn nouns into verbs. Now, that's a really interesting idea, which Gerrit Mark develops, where he says that when you merge action with performing an object, there are myriad possibilities of sentence constructions that actually challenges fixed material solidities and representations. You know, we're not looking at actual people. These are abstract ideas. So we can step back from a black miner. A black miner is not being it's a distance, a construct that we're working in here. So there's a semiotic fluidity, and we are actively affected as we reading between the puppets, the puppeteer, and the back projection. So I'm just going to show a brief clip to illustrate this idea, I hope. Okay, so we go control. Yes, no, maybe. If but when. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, the astronomical...
Okay, thank you. Let's go back. I've done a few. Did this. Okay, so through laying this puppeteer and back projection, this character is in flux, dependent on how much we know or understand. So here you've got the sense of the difference between what Wojciech is experiencing internally and what the doctor kind of gets this internal vision of him. But for him, it's quite strange. The music of the township, the kind of fear of the noises of urbanization, particularly the fear of dogs, and that's a very colonial thing, where people were controlled with dogs. So many black Africans are afraid of animals, and we think of them as our best friend. So there's this really different experience, but this insight into the other through this back projection and the sense of this dislocation, where we're both looking at, but we're made aware of the internal workings of this very disoriented person. And this kind of gives us a sense of the fluidity of these histories, these memories, this sense of experience, and how we make meaning. But this encounter is dependent on how much we engage with it, how much we really place ourselves in the gaps. So they're very different responses to Handspring's work. In South Africa, it's met with many awards, and people really understood the kind of redoing of the play in 2011. The puppeteers themselves said that, poverty, migrant labor, domestic violence is key. You can't travel through Johannesburg without looking at the mine dumps. They're very evident. The kind of wage disputes that are ongoing. And indeed, the gender-based violence is growing rather than reducing. A recent survey said that at least 1 in 3 South African women can expect to be raped in her lifetime, and 1 in 4 will be beaten by her domestic partner. So the significance of this play and the material conditions that leave men like Wojciech no other option than to become abusive, betray their families, and destructive of themselves is something that South Africans understand and can engage with. But what does this mean for the global north when we take this play to a festival? So in 2011, Darren Books said, for example, that this play was lost in translation, that it left the audience with a somewhat inaccessible and cryptic sense of the piece, and that it was hard to justify the puppets and understand where the back projections fed into the narrative. Lynn Gardner, in her review for the Guardian, kind of said that this mixture is no longer as startling as it was, and that the muddiness, the storytelling is now muddy, and the piece lacks clarity. Interestingly, in Germany, this was not the case. Stadthaller Wiesbaden said that this succeeds unlike any second staging, he means in another culture of a piece, that they found spectacular and emotionally stirring images for Wojciech's inner world of his ordeal. And what this suggested to me is that familiarity with the form is something really important. So the UK has a very particular view of puppetry and where it fits in. I think Warhorse has challenged that, but I think it's taken a long time for that to happen. But the Germans have a long tradition of puppeteering, but also they know Wojciech. It's part of their, zeitgeist. But I think it also has to do with expectations around the director, the role of the director. Does he have to be clear? What should he be doing? So there's an assumption by these English reviews that the director, needs to be doing something very clear and specific. But William Kentridge himself says that's not what he's aiming to do. He says, for him, political art is an art of ambiguity, contradiction, uncompleted gestures, and certain endings. And after what we spoke about utopia yesterday, I thought it was quite interesting, in which optimism is kept in check and nihilism at bay, which I think is quite an interesting idea. So in Africa, such a work is not about a clear vision. It's actually about opening a safe space to provoke discussion around dilemma in a fictional frame. So there is a kind of understanding of the form that perhaps is not shared, and I think this is an intercultural problem, is what are the assumptions of what we think theatre is or should be doing. And I think that's why Handspring is now doing very personal things like Or You Could Kiss Me and Warhorse, which doesn't need so much cultural translation. Although, interestingly, Warhorse has had to do that when touring to the States, Canada, and China because of the class system that is kind of profoundly at the heart of the piece. And when they've trained other casts, they've had to work around the class issues in the play. So again, there is some kind of translation that's been needed. But the extent to which audiences engage or fill these gaps, these spaces, I think spaces are really important. But we decide the level at which we engage with them, but also what we bring to fill those gaps is really important. I'm going to shift from this to speak about a very different engagement with audiences. Brian mentioned yesterday Exhibit A and B, and I'm going to revisit that now. So hopefully there won't be too much overlap. So Brett Bailey's work, his company's Third World Bun Fight, he's been described as South Africa's enfant terrible because his creative work is provocative. It places community theatre techniques alongside an eclectic mix of spiritual forms, so trance dance, sangoma, where he often constructs plays within rituals to engage audience engagement with their fear. So fear for him is a major departure point. A lot of his work could be compared with Artaud, but the difference is that he's not attempting to facilitate an authentic ritual experience at all, but he layers his performances to move audiences in and out. So you find yourself in a ritual, experiencing something, and then he does this kind of radical, melodramatic, over-the-top thing that reminds you that it's a construct and that you actually need to think about what you're doing and what you're expecting. But cultural frames are really important, and I think that understanding Exhibit A and B is very much affected by his trajectory, his previous work. So it was informed by a site-specific piece called Blood Diamond, and later he called it Terminal, that premiered at the Grahamstown Arts Festival in 2009. Now, Robin Sasson described this piece as a piece about manipulation and exploitation that rests contextually on the history of the city of Grahamstown and the massive divide and bloody fault lines which separate the obscenely wealthy from the obscenely poor in the country in general and the town in particular. Now, audiences members were ushered into a ticket office and then to wait on the platform of an old station before being taken individually by the hand by a young street child down the platform, across the bridge, into the cemetery and the dark other side of Grahamstown at night. In silence, you walked through and looked at installations of found objects. The silent journey really exposed what was the colony and what is Africa. But it was also quite strange because sometimes you weren't sure if something was an installation or actually the people that were in the place. And it was very weird because the next day you kind of find yourself looking at Grahamstown very, very differently. But it was manipulative, and you felt manipulated, and it was a highly uncomfortable piece. In the same way, this piece worked with as Exhibit A and B, where he works with local, not only performers, but ordinary people and immigrants, and in each city to stage his research of colonialism in Africa, referencing overtly 19th century human zoos in the form to challenge our sensibilities of how far are we post-colonial. This was the intention. So spectators enter a site-specific location one by one when their number is randomly called, and they silently move through rooms looking at between 12 and 14 fixed tableaux vivants that depict images of colonial history and ethnography from archives and building all the way to contemporary asylum seekers. And the most powerful and disturbing part of it is that the exhibited performers silently stare back at you as you look at them and read the plaques. So the gaze is everything. And the only sound is the last room the Herero Nama people are singing. And it's the only sound in the piece. So it references the concentration camps and genocides of the Herero and Nama people by the German colonizers in 1904. People as ethnographic found objects. So there's a woman waiting to be raped. There's Sarah Bartman, and she's on a revolving plinth. So kind of iconic images of colonial experiences. Originally, he separated out the German, Austrian experiences and the Franco-Belgian experiences. And we become accomplices as we look or choose to look or not look at this work. And it was interesting because in the media responses in 2010 and 11 were very positive. And I think part of the success of the early work was he worked with resident found spaces. So in Vienna, it was the abandoned wing of an ethnographic museum. And he said, he considered in Brussels working in the Palais de Justice or the Galerie St. Hubert. But he said, unless you frame a performance like this very carefully, informed looking and reflection becomes very difficult. So he attempts to create coevalness, referencing the past and the present, and the experiences of people that not only had colonialism, but are still experiencing it today. But what did this exhibition mean to kind of black post-colonial subjects? It was really interesting that this person who performed in Berlin in 2012, he plays an asylum seeker from Sudan, but he said, this is my story. I'm a Cameroonian. I've been in Germany since 2002. I should have been deported in 2006. I hate talking about it. It's so painful. I don't want sympathy. This is how we live every day. There is the silence, but we need to talk about these things. But the German Bühnenwatch, who protested, and the protest began in Berlin in 2012, said this is the wrong way to discuss a violent colonial history. And a South African spoken artist said, it's interesting, it was a kind of black South African speaking back to a white South African, and I think race is very important. If you have a white South African director giving orders to black performers to tell their story voicelessly, you're not breaking the legacy, you're enforcing and reproducing it. You can call it whatever you like, but the fact is that you as a white privileged person are there ordering black people around. Now, it's really interesting that Bailey assumed that he would engage with a sense of shame. Now, in South Africa, shame is a very particular meaning. It means I'm empathetically responding to you, but it doesn't mean I'm guilty. So if you cut your finger, I'll say shame, but it doesn't mean I caused it. But of course, shame and guilt were elided in the European context and became merged. There was also a very different sense of what Bailey was doing with this in South Africa, processing his own whiteness and black responses, and what happened in Europe. But I think the importance of this kind of parodic exhibition is that it did create coevalness that provoked strong reactions because the past and the colonized subjects were made visible in the present. However, his aesthetic of silence and his use of embodied realist images, and I think realism is very important here, were problematic because they replicated issues and provoked strong emotions that are not past, but are lived experiences in the present. Ironically, and perhaps significantly, some of the manipulative aesthetic did access the zone of occult instability where the people dwell in a way that few theatre productions do. Hundreds of people in major cities engaged with these issues regarding appropriate modes of representing colonialism, ownership of history and memory, whiteness, and more importantly, the responsibility of institutions like the Barbican to engage with, beyond the white middle class, to the people that live around the areas. And the same thing happened in Paris with the second, when it returned to Paris in last year, where they actually had to, and they did, to their credit, Théâtre Gérard Philippe and the Saint-Quatre Cultural Centre set up fora for discussion with local communities. And these kind of discussions were had between, we need to break the silences and we need to do it differently. And I think this highlights issues raised by Janelle Reinhardt in her essay, Rethinking the Public Sphere for the Global Age, where she speaks about multiple counter-publics inhabiting various European capital cities, in which they find themselves differentially connected to the state, civil society, and political society. And but often are invisible and not part of these discourses, and certainly not part of the programming. So almost simultaneous as this, Bailey staged Verdi's Macbeth that had very difficult images that nobody even engaged with, nobody spoke about, because people that go to the opera at the Barbican, who cares? But actually, when it became the waltz, you know, and it was mobilized through social media, it became a real intervention and engagement with these issues. And I don't think it matters whether or not we saw the piece. We had discussions for weeks with publics that maybe we never engage with. And I think the debates that follow highlight the potential art has to access a zone of occult instability where the people actually do dwell, and facilitate discussion not only about the legacies of colonialism, but also encounters between people who live side by side in major cities of the North. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. That was an incredibly powerful paper. Now, next up we have Daphne Lay, who is Professor of Drama at the University of California, Irvine. She's internationally known for her work on Chinese opera, Asian American theatre, intercultural theatre, and diasporic and transnational performance. She's the author of many scholarly articles, both in English and Chinese, and of 2 books, Operatic China and Alternative Chinese Opera in the Age of Globalization. And is also founder and director of the Multicultural Swing at Irvine. Her paper today is Can You See Yellow? Love the titles, by the way, in this panel. Can You See Yellow? Rescuing Interculturalism in Post-Racial Orientalism. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you, and thank you for the organizers and all the speakers. It's been very inspiring. I start with a question. I'm not sure I can actually answer the question from my paper. It's basically situated in the Asian American context. I feel we are kind of at a transitional stage and space. So I'm kind of laying out all these questions I have right now, or the phenomenon I'm observing right now. So according to Joseph E. Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, the Chinese century has begun. Since China now has the world's largest PPP, and this was last year. 15 years earlier, David Palombo-Liu made a similar comment, and he talks about that Asia might have arrived in the 21st century before America, and this was 1999. This type of rhetoric is not uncommon in the past 2 decades. And it seems to suggest that Asia's rising has an unsettling effect on the Western countries, especially for the self-identity of the West, like in the US. This kind of unsettling feeling is aggravated by the constant global movements from Asian countries. In other words, Asia is no longer contained in the Pacific, but has sort of spilled out into the West and constituted an important part of the domestic economy in the West. Moreover, the concept of Asian diaspora is further destabilized because of the constant movements. Richard Schachner has talked about this a long time ago. He has spoken about the 2 power languages in intercultural theater. To really exercise power, a person has to speak the 2 languages, English and money. Many Asian Americans, the traditionally seen as the model minority, are very fluent in these 2 languages. So, do I do the arrows? Yeah. So this is just to show like one of the languages, the money language. I could have shown you another like a SAT score or something to show the other English language. So they are fluent with these 2 languages, but are they the real players in the intercultural society? Despite the small number of Asian Americans, which is only actually 5.6 of the entire US population, according to the 2010 census, their apparent social mobility negates their minority status. And the reason why I say apparent, because we know there are plenty of challenges for Asian Americans, especially what they call the bamboo ceiling, not glass ceiling, but the bamboo ceiling for Asian Americans. Since the word minority is really ethnically charged, Asians are now seen as colorless and raceless. But is that really so? So I started with this kind of socioeconomic background introduction because I wanted us to think about the connection between the larger post-racial rhetoric in society and the colorblind casting or multiracial casting, multicultural casting in theater. I would also like us to specifically think about not who is included, but how is one included, as well as the intricate space between the colorblindness and color sightedness, which I see as a breeding ground for post-racial Orientalism. So if yellow is no longer a visible color, what is it? Asian social mobility is also conveniently reflected in their ethnic mobility. They are white, so they are excluded from any kind of diversity dialogue, such as in academia. They become non-white when being considered leadership positions. And they're off-white or beige, providing a perfect non-descriptive background for dramatic or television works. So they may be a classmate, a co-worker, a one-liner that contributes to the multicultural political correctness, but never steals the show. The color chameleon quality benefits everyone, but rarely works for their own benefit, their own advantage. This symptomatic problem erupted during the colorblind casting for FRSC's 2012 production, Orphan of Zhao, which I think everyone is familiar with that. Based on the casting controversy, I think it should be nicknamed as the Two Dog and the Maid Show. Right, so people are familiar with this show, right? 2012, and there's another picture. So basically, among the 17 cast members, only 3 of them are East Asian. 2 of them play a dog, and 1 play a maid. So that's why 2 dog and a maid. So one can think about this kind of tradition. It's only just this kind of casting is only sustaining a long tradition of playing Chinese in the West. We can think about started from Voltaire's Orphan of China and go through the 19th century, some of the American Chinese plays, and early 20th century Hollywood. So there are many incidents, examples of playing Asian. However, I want to also go back to the question of not who is being included, but how is one included. FRSC's remarks on this kind of controversy basically centers on their desire to cast the best actors. This kind of familiar rhetoric seems to suggest that under the neoliberal colorblind casting, anyone has the freedom to compete for the roles of any color. And those who receive the trickle-down effect at the bottom is only a demonstration of their lack of market competitiveness. Colorblind and multiracial casting are words that are often used interchangeably. However, they are actually quite contradictory concepts. If one is truly colorblind, we actually might end up with a single color casting, right? But when we say colorblind, it's never single color, right? On the other hand, in other words, in reality, colorblind means multicultural, but multicultural is not necessarily about colorblind. It's more like color blurry. It is deliberately seeing certain colors, but not seeing some others. It is about tangential inclusion, but not truly integration. When discussing the relationship between Asian American and hip hop, Tianbao to P writes, in a black and white country, one must choose being either black or white, or risk being invisible. Asian actors are caught in a state of not black and not white, but their beigeness makes them the perfect background for multiculturalism without really rocking the boat. Catherine Squire also explains the mystique of post-racial vision. The belief of an, I'm quoting here, already achieved multicultural nation draws upon neoliberal ideologies of market individualism. And this type of individualistic and ahistorical approach certainly proposes a very specific kind of framework of thinking. However, there is, I'm quoting again, a deficit of representations of a post-racial society authored by people of color. So whose post-racial society is this? Who actually benefits from this post-racial vision? So my next part of the paper will address the issue of playing Asian under this type of post-racial blurry vision. I've already talked about the FRSC production a little bit, in which yellow is either easily replaceable or can be tangentially included without actually challenging the status quo. The vision is also coupled with the notion of playing Asian with artful playfulness. I have written about Sarah Bernhardt's visit to Chinese theater in San Francisco in 1887 after seeing a choreographed fighting of Chinese opera, which she actually called childish sham battle. So after seeing this battle, she said, "It is a theater for children, and it makes one feel like a child to be in it." And she performed her own version of Chinese opera in her next visit, and this is 1891. And the San Francisco Examiner article just raves about her authentic whining and dancing, which seemed to, it was so authentic that it seemed to intimidate her fellow Chinese performer. In the new millennium, this type of artistic, playful, and authentic Asian performance has gotten to a much higher level in online performance. I will briefly talk about a couple of examples here. In 2012, a Ukrainian woman became an internet sensation with extreme weight loss and detailed makeup. She transformed herself into a Japanese anime character on YouTube. So the left, and then she became a Japanese anime character. She's 5'2", 85 pounds girl, and she was 19 at that point, 2012, and posted as a beautiful, ethereal girl with porcelain skin, delicate body, very long hair and unrealistic color, tiny nose, and beautiful, gigantic eyes. This two-dimensional Asian has a Japanese name, Fukakumi. And there are more pictures of her. Her makeup tutorial on YouTube has gone viral. There's 7 million viewers. And she's totally devoted to her authentic transformation. She spends 30 minutes on each eye for makeup, and she plans to have plastic surgery to further widen her eyes and reduce her waist. And she has fans all over the world, including many Japanese. Another case is more extreme and involves a blue-eyed, blonde Brazilian man named Max. After spending a year in Korea as an exchange student, he was determined to look like a star in K-pop. He says, "I pulled my fingers inside the eyes and pulled, and this was the way I wanted to have my eyes." After 10 plastic surgeries, he finally got the slant eye look he desired. With a Korean name Sian, dark contact lenses, and dyed black hair, this K-pop star impersonator is another internet amazement. Know that cosplay is actually a very well-known hobby, and especially in East Asia. But usually the emphasis is on the cos part, the costume part. And usually we don't, not about race, and usually there is no plastic surgery involved. But the irony here is, while the Westerners are painstakingly to authenticate themselves to be Asian, anime girls and K-pop stars usually have quite unnatural and somewhat un-Asian looks. Take the anime girl, for example. It is almost like a desexualized Barbie doll. So you can see that they have pale skin, they have really big unrealistic hair, they have very tiny face and big eyes and very, very slender, super long legs. But I mean, the only difference between this kind of body and a Barbie doll is it's much more reduced breasts and hips. So that gives them a more girly, kind of preteen, kind of girly look. And the K-pop star usually also have, sharp facial features. So these are like a few, popular ones. And so like, more prominent facial features and narrower face and all that. They both present, they both present a sort of romantic, non-sexual, aloof kind of attitude and sort of ethereal look. For instance, then you almost never look at a camera. They almost never smile. They always like, sort of present this kind of face. And for decades, Asians have been trying to look like Westerners. First through makeup and then later through plastic surgery. And they want to have bigger eyes and whiter skin, narrower face and more prominent nose. And people can even think about, curly hair or bleached skin and things like that, right? And some believe that this kind of hapa or, mixed race look or this kind of aesthetics is actually the result of the American occupation of Japan. So sort of like the war baby syndrome. And then also know that Japan and South Korea now are actually leading the fashion and pop culture trend in Asia. And South Korea is also the capital for plastic surgery tourism. So I would go there to get plastic surgery and, also as part of tourism. So there is actually more copies of these kind of hybrid looks are being produced every day. So what we consider as authentic object of mimicry, the new Oriental exoticism in the digital age, is actually not Asian at all. The imagined original itself is intentionally hybridized. As a matter of fact, one might argue that Westerners might even have a better result in transforming themselves into this kind of look. Or one might even argue that only Westerners can truly understand the Asian desire behind these fantasy characters. They really want to be white, or at least half white. So I question here, so how can one even entertain the idea of online authenticity in the age of Photoshop, right? However, just like Sarah Bernhardt's audience, today's audience are also fascinated with the notion that the authenticity here. And then also it's the playful kind of authenticity. Such yellow face receives no objection, and it is receives no objection, only amazement. No one seemed to worry that the extreme yellow up might offend the Asian race, or if non-Asians are better playing Asians, such as FRSC or the Flower Girl, what should Asian actors do? Since their off-whiteness can neither be dramatic nor authentic performance. So to correct this kind of a casting controversy of FRSC, ACT actually did a production of Orphan of Zhao. ACT is in San Francisco American Conservatory Theater. They staged the Asian version of the play, casting 11 Asian American actors and only one Caucasian actor, starring B.D. Wong as Dr. B.D. Wong is the original Song Li Ling in the Broadway and Butterfly production. So this very stylized production, directed by Carrie Perloff, featured an oversized scaffolding as the main set. Actors climb up and down the scaffolding, presenting the play in a kind of a martial style, or what I call a la Crouching Tiger. Patrice Pavis, in theorizing acting in intercultural theater, writes that actors simultaneously reveal the culture of the community where they have trained and where they live, and the bodily technique they have acquired. It is clear that these Asian American actors' natural body was actually no different from the American norm. However, in order to be Oriental here, they had to acquire bodily technique, which is actually a series of stereotypical Orientalized gestures and movements, such as fast fanning oneself, holding a lantern, small steps, doing them all together, possibly, bowing with hands, arms extended, or uttering nonsense like, hiya, hiya. The directing choices of the ACT production show that Asian actors are not quite up to par, and the American audience might not get it. Maybe they're not real Asian, we have to Asian them up. Therefore, Asian bodies need to be re-authenticated through reorientalization with familiar tokens. The decisions of casting nearly all Asian actors seemed a validation for Asian Americans' acting talent. However, they are proven insufficient without their Oriental ornament. It reconfirms RSC's implication that Asian actors are not quite good enough for Oriental performance. Mary Zimmerman's The White Snake is another play that celebrates this kind of playful spectacle that resembles a kind of sham battle of children's theater, with many fantastical Oriental gimmicks such as flowing fabric, hanging silky strips, paper umbrella and lantern, and it's beautiful production. This is also a very physical play with a lot of choreographed movements and dance, group dance and puppetry. The two snake ladies, Lady White and her maid Greenie, both manipulate puppets. A live band also accentuates the Oriental theatricality of the performance. With wonderful lighting, ingenious set design, and colorful costume and props, and all the possible technology we could ask for in the 21st century, this play nevertheless reads very old-fashioned. The headdress that the Lady White wears reminds us of the image of Anna May Wong from early 20th century. And throughout the play, a narrator will interrupt the dramatic action by citing a passage from The Secrets of Chinese Drama. For instance, during the scene at the broken bridge, Greenie raises his sword to Lady White's husband, threatening, "You treacherous, faithless villain! It is your fault that my mistress in this state. You don't deserve to live." At this point, the narrator appears, citing the passage below, while Greenie performs the action in slow motion. So this is about a hand gesture, a fighting fist. Bend the forefingers and press the thumb tightly together against the middle joint and middle finger, with the index finger curved above the thumb. The tip of this little finger should not touch the third finger because a tight fist does not look artistic. This gesture is seldom performed by a female character, with the exception of the meeting at the broken bridge, where the maid raises his finger against the master and his desertion of White Snake Lady. So this quotation interrupts the flow of dramatic action and superimposes an instruction for the audience. Again, audiences are reminded that the actors are playing Chinese and are not being Chinese. Zimmerman's gesture also echoes Erica Fischer-Lex's talk about the rules of the game for Yellow Jacket. This is an early 20th century play, and in which the non-Chinese actors acted out the prescribed daily behavior of Chinese, such as the property man's enter indifferently or smoking a pipe when moving props. This is all written as part of the stage direction. In other words, the rules of the game allow non-Chinese to play both normal and theatrical Chinese, or what Eugenio Barba refers as the daily or extra daily behaviors. In Whitesnake, the rules of the game came from the acting manual that was published in 1936. Although Zimmerman has given the old story some very new insights, her approach to the familiar legend is that kind of based on ancient Chinese fable, that kind of model, which is further framed by The Secret of Chinese Drama. This is a very old book, and there's a difference between old and ancient. Old means kind of out of date. I actually brought this book so you can take a look to see what I mean. The images are blurry and things like that. So this old book is described by Mo Zhou, the assistant director of the production, as something that has been long ignored in China and out of print. Doesn't this sound familiar to you, my reverend intercultural friends? Traditional Asian cultures and arts always have to die before intercultural collaboration can begin. Moreover, Western directors often have the noble mission to revive the old arts by giving them some new meaning. In the HIT type of intercultural performance, the directors have the poetic license to revive Western classics with katakali or Chinese opera. In a Whitesnake, Asia is doubly dead, both the text and the art. And the rules of the game are treated like a joke. Did the team of the Whitesnake deliberately choose a book that is out of print to prove that Chinese opera is indeed ancient? Or was it pure ignorance, that they're not aware of either the current practice or current scholarship? Do they know Chinese opera, like many traditional arts, are still alive and changing every day? Plays on so I'm moving to another play. Plays on contemporary theme have an even harder time, since they can't even disguise under the gorgeous costume on Kung Fu movement. A recent play by Kimberly Lee, Tokyo Fish Story, which centers on the theme of conflict between traditional and modern cultures and values and generations. A large portion of the play takes place in a sushi restaurant, the kitchen of a sushi restaurant. So it's the middle is the chef, and on the right-hand side is the older apprentice, and the left side is the younger apprentice. So Nobu, the one on the left side, the younger apprentice, jokes about the older apprentice, Takashi, who is very devoted to perfecting the art. Nobu is a character, or we can say a caricature, who talks and gestures like a rapper, and sings and MC Hammer's Bust a Move, and calls Takashi bro. When Takashi doesn't respond, Nobu calls him an inscrutable Asian stereotype. Takashi says, "It's not a stereotype in Japan, dummy. We all act this way." Nobu says, "What? Stoic?" Takashi says, "No, dignified." And a young female employer named Ama, who also makes a comment on Nobu's mannerism. "You sound ridiculous, you know? You're not Jay-Z. You certainly didn't grow up in the hood." In other words, the rules of the game In other words, the norm that Takashi refers to, we all act the way here, is invisible, unless it is foiled by Noble's pretend blackness. Asian American plays often present Asian versus this kind of binary Asian versus American as a way to discuss generational conflicts. However, the traditional kind of binarism is usually like traditional Asian versus contemporary white American. In Tokyo Story, we can clearly see that now such traditional binarism is being challenged by the post-racial concept, since the Asian mobility has moved them closer to the white end of the color spectrum. Again, quoting the Tianbang to be again, in a black and white society, one must choose to be either white or black or risk being invisible. In order to present Takashi's Asian norm, Noble has to be black. In other words, the full Asian cast has to be internally interracial, interculturalized in order for us to see the yellow more clearly. So looking at the current state of Asian performances and watching the post-racial Orientalism quietly strip away the yellowness of Asian American actors, I find myself in a really agitated state of confusion, frustration, and annoyance. I'm not nostalgic for a stabilized Orientalist yellowness, or am I? But on the other hand, I wonder, how do I speak of interculturalism if yellow is constantly made elusive or transparent by state policy or colorblind casting or multicultural directing choices? Post-racial Orientalism freely moves Asian actors up and down the color spectrum between black and white, renders them invisible or replaceable for the sake of political correctness, fashion, power, or simply for the sake of convenience. So, do you see yellow? I'm not sure you do, but I no longer know what the meaning of yellow really is.